Hello, friends. Have you heard about shifting? Does the name Neville Goddard sound familiar to you? Have you ever wanted to change certain habits and found yourself unable to escape your automatic responses? Today, we are going to approach this topic from different perspectives, from the psychological one, and also from groundbreaking perspectives, from esotericism, from quantum mysticism, and from both Western and Eastern traditions. Shall we? Let's get to it. Conscious shifting, understood from psychology, can be described as the deliberate ability to modify one's own mental and emotional state through awareness. It is not a superficial change of attitude, but an internal process that involves metacognition, emotional regulation, and intentional choice of response. In everyday life, people operate much of the time on autopilot. Our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are chained almost mechanically from previous experience, learned beliefs, and unconscious patterns. Conscious shifting occurs when that automatism is interrupted. It is the moment when the individual observes their own internal state, recognizes what is happening, a limiting thought, an intense emotion, an impulsive reaction, and, instead of acting from there, consciously chooses a different way of positioning themselves. From cognitive psychology, this process is related to the ability of cognitive reframing. By taking distance from mental content, I am having this thought, instead of this thought is me, the person regains room to maneuver. The external fact does not change, but the interpretation does, which modifies the emotional and behavioral response. In that sense, conscious shifting does not seek to control reality, but to recover authorship over subjective experience. It is important to emphasize that a conscious shift does not imply denying, repressing, or forcing positive thinking. Contrary, it begins with an act of psychological honesty. Recognizing the current state without judgment. Anxiety, frustration, fear are not errors to be eliminated, but signals that inform about an internal experience. Change occurs when, once recognized, those emotions stop automatically governing behavior. From the perspective of emotional regulation, conscious shifting involves moving from a primary reaction to a chosen response. This activates executive functions associated with the prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making, planning, and self-control. In practical terms, the person stops being dragged by emotional inertia and adopts a more reflective and flexible position toward the situation. At a deeper level, this type of change has a cumulative impact. Each time a person performs a conscious shift, they weaken old patterns and reinforce new ones. It is not an isolated event nor a permanent state, but a sustained practice. Over time, what initially requires effort and attention becomes more accessible, generating a greater sense of internal coherence, psychological autonomy, and emotional stability. Conscious shifting is an advanced psychological skill. The ability to inhabit internal experience, recognize one's own mental and emotional processes, and choose within what is possible how to respond to them. It offers something powerful: the possibility of not being trapped in internal states that no longer serve, and of building a more mature and responsible relationship with oneself. For conscious shifting to stop being an abstract concept and become a real experience, it is necessary to understand that it does not arise from momentary willpower, but from the systematic training of certain psychological functions. It is not about thinking differently for the sake of it, but developing the ability to interrupt automatic patterns and progressively recover the capacity for choice. The first pillar of this process is the training of awareness. From psychology, This implies learning to observe one's internal experience, thoughts, emotions, and bodily sensations without reacting immediately to it. The practice of mindfulness, understood in a clinical rather than spiritualized way, this function. It strengthens metacognition, that is, the ability to think about what one is thinking. When a person manages to recognize as a thought as a transient mental event and not as an absolute truth, the psychological space where conscious shifting can occur is created. Once that gap between stimulus and response is opened, cognitive restructuring comes into play. Here the change is not passive, but active. The individual examines their automatic interpretations and evaluates their degree of reality, usefulness, and coherence. This process, typical of cognitive behavioral therapy, does not seek to generate positive thoughts, but more accurate and functional ones. Conscious shifting, at this level, consists of replacing rigid and global narratives with more precise formulations, which has a direct impact on emotional regulation. However, not all internal states can be modified solely through thought. When the nervous system is highly activated in anxiety, anger, or intense stress, capacity for reflection is limited. Therefore, another essential conscious shifting is working with the body. Breathing techniques, muscle relaxation, or conscious movement act from the bottom up, regulating physiological activation and restoring the system's capacity for self-regulation. In many cases, a true change in perspective only possible after the body has exited the threat state. At a deeper level, approaches such as acceptance and commitment therapy introduce a key idea. Not all discomfort needs to be eliminated for a shift to occur. Learning to accept internal experience without fusing with it allows the person to act from their values and not from the impulse to avoid pain. In this sense, conscious shifting does not always manifest as an immediate emotional change, but as a change in the way of relating to what is felt. The consolidation of this capacity also requires training conscious pause. Simple but structured techniques, such as stopping, observing, and proceeding with intention, function as deliberate interruptions of reactive habit. Each pause of this kind weakens automatic inertia and reinforces a more reflective response. Over time, these micro-interruptions identify deeply rooted behavioral patterns. Another fundamental resource is structured reflective writing. By externalizing internal experience into words, the mind gains clarity and perspective. It is not about venting emotions, but about organizing experience, identifying patterns, and rehearsing more conscious responses. Writing acts as a bridge between emotional experience and rational understanding, facilitating shifts that would otherwise go unnoticed. In its most advanced form, conscious shifting involves working on identity and personal narrative. As the person stops defining themselves exclusively by their mental or emotional states, a more stable internal position emerges. The observing self. From there, thoughts and emotions cease to be threats, absolute truths, and become experiences that occur, but do not completely determine behavior or the sense of self. Taken together, these techniques do not promise total control over internal experience nor a life free of discomfort. What they offer is something more realistic and deeper. The possibility of not being trapped in automatic patterns, of responding with greater psychological flexibility, to building, through sustained practice, a more conscious, mature, and responsible relationship with oneself. Conscious shifting, understood this way, is not a destination, but a capacity that strengthens over time and intention. Integrating conscious shifting in moments of crisis means bringing this capacity to its most demanding scenario. situations in which emotional intensity is high and cognitive resources are partially compromised. From psychology, a crisis is not defined only by what happens externally, but by the internal overflow that limits the usual capacity for self-regulation. Precisely for that reason, here conscious shifting cannot be understood as a complete change of state, but as a minimal yet decisive intervention. In crisis contexts, the main objective is not to feel good, nor even to think clearly, but to prevent the psychological system from collapsing or becoming rigid. The first step consists of redefining what it means to integrate the shift in these moments. It is not about applying all the learned techniques, but about activating a single key function that reduces harm and preserves the capacity for choice. In a crisis, the nervous system operates in threat mode, prioritizing survival over reflection. Trying to reason or reframe thoughts in that state often proves frustrating. Therefore, conscious shifting begins here as a basic physiological intervention, slowing the breath, extending the exhalation, releasing muscle tension, or anchoring attention in concrete physical sensations. This gesture does not resolve the crisis, but reduces activation enough to avoid impulsive reaction. Once the bodily response is minimally contained, the next level of the shift consists of naming the internal experience precisely, not analyzing it, not explaining it, just recognizing it. This is intense anxiety. This fear. This is. From psychology, this act of emotional labeling has a regulating effect in itself. Naming what is happening transforms a diffuse and overwhelming experience into something bounded, and returns to the person an initial sense of internal control. At this point, conscious shifting takes on a particularly important foreign crisis: the separation between experience and action. The person learns to say to themselves, explicitly or implicitly, "This is what I am feeling, and I not have to act from here." This is not emotional change, but a change in the relationship with the emotion. Distress may still be present, but it ceases to be the only driver of behavior, unlike in calm contexts. In a crisis, shifting does not aim to restructure complex thoughts, but to introduce a simple and functional question: what is the least harmful thing I can do right now? This question shifts the focus from total control to impact reduction, which is psychologically realistic in states of high activation. Another key element is strategic acceptance. In moments of crisis, fighting against intolerance usually intensifies it. Integrating conscious shifting here implies recognizing that discomfort is present and that, for the moment, it does not need to be eliminated in order to get through the situation. This acceptance is not resignation, but a way of conserving psychological energy and avoiding emotional escalation. With practice, conscious shifting in crisis becomes refined. What at first is only a brief pause, a second of breathing, an internal phrase, a decision not to impulsively become a trained internal response. The person begins to recognize early signs of regulation and intervene before the crisis reaches its peak. It is important to emphasize that integrating conscious in crisis does not mean always handling them successfully, nor avoiding pain, nor responding perfectly. It means something more sober and more human, reducing loss of control, preserving psychological dignity, and maintaining, even in discomfort, a minimal contact with own capacity for choice. In the long term, this mode of intervention changes the person's relationship with their crises. They cease to be experienced exclusively as threats or personal failures, and become spaces of training where a more flexible and conscious way of being with oneself is consolidated. Conscious shifting, in this context, is not a heroic act. but a quiet practice that allows one to go through difficulty without being defined by it. Connecting conscious shiftings and decision-making implies moving from managing specific states to the daily architecture of behavior. From psychology, habits are not simple routines, but automated responses that the brain executes to save energy. Precisely for that reason, conscious shifting does not compete with habits, but acts before, during, or after them, modifying the terrain where they are formed and sustained. First, conscious shifting introduces a fundamental change in the relationship between impulse and action. Most habits, especially dysfunctional ones, are not maintained because the person actively chooses them, but because they respond to a specific internal state: fatigue, anxiety, boredom, stress. Conscious shifting allows identifying that state as a trigger, not as an order. That recognition does not eliminate the impulse, but it creates a fraction of time in which the person can decide whether to follow it or not. That fraction, however minimal, is the exact point where the habit is reconfigured. From this perspective, conscious shifting doth consist of having willpower, but of seeing the process in real time. When a person notices, "I am about to do this to regulate what I feel," they have already partially stepped out of automatism. Even if they choose to repeat the habit, they do with greater awareness, which progressively weakens its compulsive nature. In learning psychology, this change in the relationship with behavior is key to modifying patterns in the long term. Regarding decision-making, conscious shifting fulfills an even more structural function. Many decisions are not made from values or goals, but from transient emotional states. Deciding under anxiety, for example, usually directs behavior toward avoidance. Deciding from frustration tends to favor impulsive or defensive responses. Conscious shifting allows recognizing the state from which one is deciding and asking, explicitly or implicitly, "Do I want this emotion to make the decision for me?" This question does not eliminate the emotion, but prevents it from governing invisibly. With practice, conscious shifting shifts the center of gravity of decision-making, from immediate relief to medium and long-term criteria. Here the link with personal values comes into play. When a person has trained the ability to observe their internal experience without fusing with it, they can choose behaviors that do not coincide with what they feel like doing in the moment, but do align with what they consider important. This type of decision is neither heroic nor rigid. It is functional and coherent. In the realm of healthy habits, conscious shifting also acts as a maintenance mechanism. It is not only about initiating a new behavior, but sustaining it when initial enthusiasm disappears. In those moments, change does not depend on motivation, but on the ability to recognize thoughts, "I don't feel like it," or "this doesn't work," as passing mental events. The shift allows not arguing with those thoughts, nor automatically obeying them, maintaining action despite internal fluctuation. In the long term, the repetition of these micro-shifts produces a cumulative effect. Conscious decisions reinforce certain habits, and those habits, in turn, reduce the need to constantly decide. Thus, a virtuous circle is created where daily behavior increasingly reflects the chosen identity and less the emotional reaction of the moment. The person does not live in a state of permanent self-control, but in a system better aligned with their values. Conscious shifting is the bridge between awareness and behavior. It allows intervention at the exact point where habits activated and where decisions are biased by the internal state. It does not guarantee perfect choices or impeccable habits, but it does offer something psychologically more sustainable: the possibility of building a life in which actions are not dictated solely by emotional urgency, but by a broader understanding of what one wants to sustain over time. Beyond the psychological approach, the concept of shifting also appears in various esoteric, spiritual, and metaphysical traditions, where it is given a broader, in many cases, more radical meaning. Although the language and explanations differ significantly, these traditions share a common intuition. The experience of reality is not fixed, but depends on the state of consciousness from which it is lived. In these frameworks, shifting is not limited to a change of internal interpretation, but is described as a movement of consciousness toward another experienced form of reality. Changing state not only modifies how things perceived, but is equivalent, symbolically or literally depending on the tradition, to moving toward another version of life, the self, or the world. Reality ceases to be understood as a single and immutable stage, and is conceived as something dynamic, sensitive to the internal state of the earth. One of the clearest influences in this view is the work of Neville Goddard, who argued consciousness is the fundamental cause of experience. From this perspective, the shift occurs when a person abandons the psychological state of desire, which implies lack and waiting, and internally assumes state of what they already consider accomplished. It is not only about imagining, but about emotionally and mentally inhabiting a different identity, coherent with the result one wishes to experience. In esoteric terms, this is interpreted as a change of reality. In psychological terms, as a sustained identification with an internal narrative that reorganizes perception, behavior, and decisions. In more contemporary currents, especially in digital communities, the term reality shiftings on an even more literal meaning. Here, there is explicit talk of transferring consciousness, other existing realities, sometimes completely different from everyday life, including fictional worlds or alternative lives. The associated practices often involve deep visualization, states close to sleep, repetition of affirmations, and strong attentional focus. From a psychological perspective, these experiences can be understood as states of vivid imagination, mild dissociation, or phenomena close to lucid dreaming. From within the esoteric framework, however, they are not experienced as fantasy, but as a real movement of consciousness beyond usual limits. Another common branch is the so-called quantum interpretation of shifting, which uses concepts such as timelines, vibration, collapse of possibilities, or multiverses, which we have discussed in other episodes. In this language, shifting is conceived as a conscious tuning into a specific possibility, which becomes actualized in experience when the individual manages to align with it. Although these ideas do not use physics rigorously, they function as powerful metaphors to speak about potential, indeterminacy, and non-linearity. Psychologically, this approach can be translated as the combined effect of expectation, selective attention, and coherence between beliefs and actions. Spiritually, it is experienced as a vibrational alignment with a desired reality. If the perspective is broadened further, similar notions can be found in much older, Western traditions. In Buddhism, for example, the fundamental change is not of external reality, but of identification with phenomena. By modifying the relationship with the self and experience, the lived world transforms. In Advaita Vedanta, the shift occurs when the sense of identity moves from the ego to a broader consciousness. In shamanism and mysticism, changes in states of consciousness allow access to symbolic realities, although not understood literally, have a profound impact on the experience and meaning of life. What is important is to recognize that all these currents, including psychology, point to the same experiential core. When the state of consciousness changes, the reality that is experienced changes. The difference lies not so much in the phenomenon as in the explanation given and in the degree of literalness with which it is interpreted. Psychology describes changes in perception, emotion, and behavior. Esoteric currents speak of realities, planes, or timelines. They are different languages for addressing a real subjective transformation. The use of these symbolic frameworks is not necessarily problematic. In fact, they can be psychologically powerful when used with maturity, as they provide meaning, motivation, and a narrative of change. The risk appears when the concept of shifting is used to deny reality, a personal responsibility, or blame the individual for everything that happens in their life. In those cases, the language stops being a tool for transformation and becomes a form of avoidance. Understood deeply, shifting, whether explained from psychology or from esotericism, is not a magical act nor an escape from reality, but a way of describing the change in the position from which a person lives, interprets, and responds to their experience. What truly shifts is not the world itself, but the internal place from which it is inhabited. And that shift, although named in different ways, has real consequences in how one lives, decides, and relates to oneself and to life. To understand conscious shifting, it is not enough to grasp it theoretically. It is necessary to experience it firsthand, even in a simple way. The following exercise is designed to applied in everyday situations and allows observing directly how autopilot is interrupted and the capacity for choice is recovered. It does not require special conditions or ideal emotional states, only a willingness to observe honestly. The first step is to identify a real situation in which you have reacted automatically. It can be a recent moment of discomfort, urgency, or unease. Conversation you avoided, an impulsive response, the tendency to distract yourself, procrastinate, or act out of inertia. It is important that it is not an extreme episode, but something habitual. The key is to recognize it. When this happens, I usually react this way. Once the situation is identified, the exercise continues with the conscious observation of the internal experience. It involves mentally returning to that moment and noticing, without trying to change anything, what thoughts appeared, what emotion predominated, and how manifested in the body. Perhaps automatic internal phrases arise, a sensation of freshness or tension in some part of the body. In this phase, nothing is corrected or analyzed, it is simply observed. Here the shift has not yet occurred, but the ground is being prepared for it to be possible. The conscious shift is introduced when a deliberate phrase of recognition is added that changes the relationship with the internal experience. The person says to themselves calmly and precisely, "I am noticing this, and I do not have to act from here." Does not seek to eliminate the emotion or thought, but to establish a minimal distance between what is felt and what is done. Accompanying this moment with a slow breath helps the body register the pause. At this point, even if the internal experience is still present, it no longer automatically directs behavior. From there, the exercise moves toward the conscious choice of a minimal action. It is not about deciding what would be ideal, nor forcing an exemplary response, but about honestly asking what the least reactive action possible is at that moment. It can be something very small, not responding yet, moving a little, writing instead of speaking, continuing a task for a few more minutes, or simply stopping. That micro decision is fundamental because it transforms awareness into behavior. The exercise closes with an internal gesture of validation of the process, reminding oneself that this is practice. Perfection prevents learning from being interfered with by self-demand or judgment. Each time this process is carried out, even if the result is not as expected, automatism is weakened and the capacity for choice strengthened. This exercise trains the central skill of conscious shifting, not immediately changing what is felt, but changing who decides what to do with what is felt. With repetition, these pauses become more accessible. Habu's rigidity and decisions begin to align more consistently with a more conscious and less reactive way of relating to one's internal experience. Interesting pick, don't you think? Best regards, friends.